The Smith Plantation sprawled across the lowlands of Mississippi, its cotton fields stretching toward the horizon like a sea of white under the hot, unforgiving sun of 1859. The rows were uniform, ordered, yet beneath the surface, life was fragmented, torn, and burdened with fear. Every day the enslaved laborers bent to the soil, their hands blistered, their backs scarred, their eyes wary of the overseer's approach. In the quarters, the cabins were crowded and dark, the air thick with smoke from cooking fires and the sweat of too many bodies in too little space. It was here, in the narrow, suffocating spaces of forced existence, that whispers of defiance began to spread like wildfire. These were not mere rumors. They were stories of secret gatherings, of distant news from other plantations where resistance had taken root, of the courage of men and women who refused to bow silently. Among them, a young man named Elijah emerged, his quiet demeanor belying the intensity of thought that burned behind his eyes. He had watched his father beaten, his mother kneel in silent prayer, and friends disappear in chains sold southward, and he carried the memory of each wound as if it were a map, marking every injustice, every moment of cruelty. Elijah's mind worked constantly, turning fear into strategy, despair into planning. In the dead of night, when the plantation lay under a blanket of stars and the masters slept behind closed shutters, he and a small group of trusted friends met in the shadow of the woods at the far edge of the fields. Their gatherings were careful, deliberate, marked by an unspoken understanding that a single misstep could mean death. They spoke of freedom in fragments, in coded language, in careful phrases that carried layers of meaning only those present could understand. The older men, those who had lived through decades of bondage, offered wisdom tempered by experience, patience, secrecy, and vigilance. The young ones, with their bodies still full of energy and their hearts full of fire, brought the boldness that only youth could supply. Together they formed a fragile network, bound by the knowledge that their lives were counted as less than nothing by those who claimed ownership over them. Rumors reached them of other plantations where revolt had been attempted, some crushed before dawn, others fleetingly successful. Each story, whether of triumph or failure, fueled the imagination and sharpened the resolve. Elijah's group studied the movements of the overseers, the schedules of patrols, the weak points in fences and gates. They learned to read the rhythms of the plantation, the times when the masters dined, the moments when the dogs were tethered, the hours when night fell thick enough to hide shadowed movement. Every detail mattered, every observation was a piece of armor, a thread in a web that, if woven carefully, could protect them and perhaps one day allow them to break free. But the stakes were unbearably high. The law and custom of the South made the penalty for rebellion absolute. Death, often slow in public, was the standard punishment. Families could be torn apart for a single whisper of disobedience. Even suspicion alone invited violence. The enslaved knew this, yet the cruelty they endured made the prospect of freedom more urgent than the threat of punishment. The fire of resistance was born not from recklessness but from necessity. It was a fire that would consume everything if mismanaged, but it also carried a light that promised the possibility of liberation, however fleeting. Elijah's leadership was quiet but firm. He understood that courage alone was not enough. Planning, patience, and trust were required. Each new recruit was tested carefully, sent on errands that disguised observation, asked to relay messages in code, challenged to prove both loyalty and discretion. Mistakes could not be tolerated. A slip of the tongue, a misplaced gesture, a whispered word to the wrong person could unravel months of preparation and lead to death not just for the guilty, but for everyone connected to them. And yet the human instinct for hope, for community, for justice propelled them forward. In hushed voices around hidden fires, they shared stories of ancestors who had resisted in secret, of marooned communities that survived in swamps and forests, of distant lands where liberty had been a tangible, living thing. As the weeks turned into months, the planning grew more intricate. Maps were drawn in the dirt, pathways through the river reeds were memorized, signals for assembly were devised. They spoke in metaphor, using the songs of the fields to convey times and directions, embedding instructions in melodies that the overseers heard but could not comprehend. Every hymn, every chant, every whispered line of verse carried meaning beyond devotion. It became a coded language of freedom, a testament to resilience in a world determined to erase their agency. The fear of betrayal hung over them constantly. but the bonds forged in secrecy and shared suffering strengthened their resolve. Despite their careful planning, they remained acutely aware that the plantation itself was a living, watching entity. The overseers, though brutish, were observant. Dogs prowled the edges of the woods, and sentries moved along the fences with eyes sharp for any sign of nocturnal disturbance. Every night Elijah's group crept back from their hidden meetings with hearts pounding, aware that a single misstep could end their lives in a bloody spectacle meant to deter all who might think to follow. Each return to the quarters was tense, every glance over the shoulder, every cautious step on uneven ground, reminded them of the thin line they walked between survival and death. In the midst of this careful balance, a tension began to grow within the group. Different generations brought different perspectives on risk and timing. The younger men and women were impatient, eager for action, their desire for immediate freedom outweighing the caution the elders insisted upon. Elijah worked to mediate, to temper bold impulses with strategy, to channel their energy toward preparation rather than premature confrontation. He spoke often of patience as an act of courage, of silence as a weapon, of time as an ally. These lessons were hard-earned, born from the knowledge that one miscalculation could destroy the fragile hope that still survived beneath the whip and the lash. Meanwhile, the plantation hummed with its ordinary routine. The masters remained oblivious to the storm gathering in their midst, confident in the power of law, hierarchy, and intimidation. The Smith family, accustomed to unquestioned authority, believed the fields would bend to their control, as they always had. They noted, perhaps with mild irritation, when tools went missing or when cotton bales were found damaged, but they attributed these losses to laziness or accident, never to the deliberate plotting of those whose lives were chained yet whose minds had begun to taste liberty. The illusion of total dominion masked the reality that a profound and dangerous shift was taking place. Elijah's group began to experiment with small acts of defiance, tools misplaced, minor sabotages in the work schedule, messages embedded in the field songs. Each act was calculated, designed to test both the security of the plantation and the nerve of the overseers. They observed carefully how the masters reacted, taking note of patterns, understanding the limits of their power. With each success, confidence grew. With each failure, caution was renewed. And yet, beneath all these maneuvers, there was a simmering tension, a sense that the moment for direct action would inevitably arrive, and when it did, the consequences could be catastrophic. The narrative of rebellion, however cautious, could not remain entirely invisible. Hushed conversations in the quarters, glimpses of furtive meetings near the woods, the quiet disappearance of men and women during the long hours of labor, all of it carried risk. It only required one misstep, one betrayal, one moment of panic to shatter the fragile web of secrecy. And as the year wore on toward late summer, whispers of impending revolt began to circulate beyond the quarters, reaching ears that would never forgive, never forget, never hesitate to retaliate with lethal force. Elijah often lay awake at night, listening to the distant sounds of dogs and sentries, the rustle of leaves, the crack of twigs in the dark, thinking of the delicate balance between courage and recklessness. He knew the plan had to be precise, that timing had to be impeccable, that every participant needed absolute trust, and yet he also understood that waiting too long might kill the momentum, the hope, the very spark of defiance that had brought them together. Each passing day was a test not just of secrecy but of will. The fire in their hearts could not be allowed to go cold, for it was this fire that would determine whether they remained silent victims or active agents of their own fate. In the last weeks before the revolt, tension and anticipation intertwined like twin vines. The group's movements became more deliberate, the coded songs more complex, the secret paths more familiar. Every night Elijah retraced steps through the fields and woods, imagining the plantation asleep, the overseers oblivious, the masters dreaming of power that no longer truly belonged to them. He felt the weight of history pressing down upon him, the legacy of those who had endured centuries of bondage, the memory of those lost to the auction blocks and chains. He carried that weight silently, knowing that the decisions he made now could echo far beyond the confines of the Smith Plantation, shaping the lives of countless souls in ways both immediate and unimaginable. As the summer of 1859 deepened, the tension on the Smith Plantation became almost tangible. a weight pressing on every heart and muscle of the enslaved people who had dared to dream of rebellion. Days were long and punishing, the sun relentless on their backs as they bent over cotton and corn. Yet each movement carried a hidden consciousness, a dual awareness of labor and secret preparation. Elijah and his small circle of conspirators moved carefully within this dual reality, appearing obedient while planning in whispers, tracing paths on the ground, memorizing the positions of sentries and the routines of overseers. Even the smallest gesture could betray them. A glance held too long, a step too quick, a note dropped or misread. The stakes were life itself, and yet the young men and women pressed forward, spurred by generations of injustice and the aching memory of freedom lost. The conspirators learned to read the subtleties of the plantation as if it were a living entity, each fence, barn, and quarter a part of a network of observation and control. They discovered weaknesses in the patrols, timing their movements to coincide with the shifts of dogs and overseers, mapping escape routes through the woods and swamps that bordered the fields. Songs and work chants became coded messages, layered with meaning that could guide or warn, signals that carried across the quarters, yet remained unintelligible to the masters. The smallest act of sabotage, a loosened bolt on a wagon, a hidden pile of broken tools, became a rehearsal for the greater rebellion they envisioned, proof that even in chains, they could assert agency. Every gesture, every whispered plan was a defiance in itself, a crack in the edifice of domination that the Smith family had built over decades. Yet the human element was never to be underestimated, and the risk of betrayal was always present. Among those who worked alongside Elijah and his closest allies was a young man named Thomas, whose family had been recently purchased from a neighboring county. He was clever and ambitious, eager to prove his worth, and though outwardly he seemed committed to the cause, the weight of fear and the lure of reward from the Smiths created an undercurrent of uncertainty. Elijah sensed the tension, the subtle hesitations in Thomas's eyes, the questions that were asked too cautiously, the stories he sometimes told of overhearing plans beyond his station. Distrust, even in a small measure, could poison the entire effort, and Elijah carried the responsibility of navigating this precarious balance. The conspirators' network depended on absolute discretion. A single slip, a single shared secret could ignite the flames of catastrophe. Despite the risk, the revolt began to crystallize into something tangible. The conspirators plotted the uprising for a night in late August, when the moon would be full and high, providing enough light for movement but masking faces and forms against the shadowed edges of the quarters and woods. Weapons were rudimentary but deadly: axes, knives, hidden clubs, and a small cache of stolen pistols. The men and women practiced in secret, developing signals for assembly, escape routes, and responses to the inevitable violence. Even the simplest plan was suffused with the possibility of death. Yet the moral imperative of resistance outweighed fear. Every participant understood that the choice was between living under perpetual chains or risking everything for a chance, however slim, at freedom. The Douai. Weeks leading up to the revolt were fraught with subtle crises. Supplies went missing, rumors spread, and the constant presence of overseers meant that every clandestine meeting required careful coordination. The conspirators learned to communicate in silence, in gestures and glances, in shifts in the rhythm of songs sung in the fields. Each day Elijah balanced caution with urgency, seeking to maintain morale while keeping the group hidden from prying eyes. The enslaved on the plantation began to notice slight irregularities, the hushed conversations, the rearranged tools, the strange glances that passed between certain men and women. But fear and uncertainty kept them quiet, unsure if joining meant life or death. As the day of the planned uprising drew near, tension mounted not only among the conspirators but across the plantation as a whole. Rumors of unrest from neighboring estates had reached the Smiths. Small fires, hurried escapes, even a story of a family in Natchez who had fled under cover of night. These tales, though distant, sharpened the planters' paranoia. The overseers became more vigilant, pacing the quarters with rifles in hand, scrutinizing movements, interrogating those who lingered near the woods. Every delay, every questioning glance from a master heightened the risk, but also, in a twisted way, confirmed the necessity of action. To wait longer would be to invite suspicion. To act too soon could lead to annihilation. Within this pressure cooker, the seeds of betrayal began to take root. Thomas, struggling with the weight of his own fear and the temptation of a reward offered quietly by one of the Smiths, made a fateful decision. One evening, as the conspirators gathered in the shadows near the creek, he slipped away under the guise of gathering water, his conscience tormented but overridden by a desperate hope for safety and favor. Once within earshot of the overseer, he relayed fragments of what he had observed, mentions of meeting points, hints of weapons, the cadence of songs that carried hidden instructions. Though incomplete, his report was enough to ignite suspicion, and the overseer immediately began to increase patrols, setting traps, and watching for anomalies. The conspirators, unaware of the betrayal at first, noticed subtle changes, the increase in surveillance, the sharp questioning of minor infractions, the sudden rearrangement of field schedules, but could not yet pinpoint the source. By mid-August, the night chosen for revolt approached with an electric tension that gripped every conspirator. Preparations were meticulous. Escape routes had been memorized, weapons distributed, signals agreed upon. Every person involved understood that once the plan was set in motion, there would be no turning back. The night promised both possibility and peril, a thin veil between oppression and the unknown. Yet even as they approached the precipice of action, unease began to fester. Hints of surveillance and increased suspicion created a subtle but pervasive anxiety, and Elijah felt the heavy burden of responsibility as both strategist and moral guide. The lives of dozens of men and women rested on his judgment, his clarity, and his ability to read the human and natural forces around them. The evening before the planned revolt was unusually quiet. The plantation seemed almost asleep, with only the occasional bark of a dog or the scrape of a boot disturbing the stillness. The conspirators gathered one last time, moving silently through the woods, reviewing their plan, checking their weapons, and whispering warnings to one another. They reaffirmed their trust in each other, their belief in the necessity of their action, and their hope that courage could prevail over fear. Yet beneath this shared resolve lurked the unknown, the hidden threat of betrayal that none could fully anticipate, and the cruel unpredictability of violence when it came to a people determined to retain control at any cost. When night fell, a strange tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The enslaved moved toward their hidden rendezvous points, hearts pounding, eyes alert to every sound, every shadow. The full moon illuminated the paths in silver light, but did little to lessen the fear that coursed through their veins. They were ready, yet unknowingly. The betrayal that had begun with Thomas's choice had already altered the landscape of danger. The overseers had been tipped off to certain movements, certain timings, and the Smith family, in their arrogance, believed they were acting prudently to protect their property. But in doing so, they set the stage for a tragedy that would unfold with brutal swiftness, claiming both the guilty and the innocent and leaving a mark on the history of the South that would never be forgotten. By midnight, the conspirators had assembled at their chosen point near the woods, silent and tense, with weapons in hand and minds alert to every possibility. Their plan, so meticulously rehearsed, now hung by a thread. The betrayal, though incomplete, had already initiated a cascade of consequences that none could foresee fully. The overseers were watching. The dogs had been alerted, and the faintest crack of a branch could signal doom. And yet, despite this looming danger, Elijah and the others pressed forward, driven by the same imperative that had guided them from the beginning, the need to claim, even briefly, a taste of freedom from a world that had offered them none, The night of the revolt arrived with a heavy, suffocating stillness. The Smith Plantation lay under a pall of moonlight, the cotton fields silvered and whispering in the breeze, yet the stillness was deceptive. Every rustle in the trees, every distant bark of a dog, every snap of a twig carried a weight, signaling both the possibilities of liberation and the imminence of danger. Elijah and his group moved like shadows through the underbrush, each step deliberate, each heartbeat a drum in the quiet night. They had rehearsed this for months, the paths, the timing, the signals, but no preparation could fully account for the treachery that had already begun to unravel their careful plans. Thomas's betrayal had been subtle, enough to alert the overseers without revealing the entirety of the conspiracy, a whisper in the right ear that turned vigilance into deadly anticipation. By the edge of the woods, Elijah paused, signaling the others to wait, his breath shallow in the humid air. He listened for signs, for the subtle differences that marked danger. And then he heard it. A distant shout, sharp and unnatural, followed by the echo of hooves and the rustle of men moving through the fields. The dogs were restless now, their barking punctuating the darkness, their ears angled toward some unseen intruder. The trap had been set. What had been planned as a night of liberation now threatened to transform into a massacre. Panic fluttered in the chest of every conspirator, yet they pressed on, driven by a combination of desperation and hope that had brought them this far. The revolt began with a small flare of action. Elijah signaled with a raised hand, and a group of men darted toward the nearest overseer's cabin, intending to disable the sentries and seize weapons. Others followed, fanning out across the plantation, their movement swift and quiet, honed by months of preparation and fear. For a brief moment it seemed as if the plan might succeed. The overseers were caught off guard by the suddenness, and the enslaved fighters moved with a coordinated urgency that belied their inexperience. Yet in the distance shadows moved differently, figures not of their making, alert and prepared. Thomas, standing silently among the men he had once considered allies, watched with an expression that betrayed neither fear nor remorse. His decision had placed them in immediate peril, and the consequences were about to unfold. As the first confrontation erupted, fire became both weapon and witness. Torches lit in haste illuminated the chaos, flickering against the walls of the cabins and the edges of the fields. Smoke curled upward, carrying with it the acrid scent of burning wood and the metallic tang of blood. The rebels struck quickly, but the overseers, forewarned by Thomas's warnings, met them with rifles and clubs, transforming the night into a crucible of violence. Shouts pierced the darkness, followed by screams of pain and terror. The carefully rehearsed strategies fell apart under the weight of surprise and betrayal. Men and women who had trained for months found themselves confronting death with nothing but courage and crude weapons, the ideal of freedom colliding violently with the reality of mortal danger. Elijah fought to maintain control amidst the chaos. He moved among his people, guiding, warning, and rallying them, his voice a low murmur amidst the din of violence. He struck quickly, disarmed a man here, shielded a comrade there, every motion a desperate attempt to preserve life while continuing the revolt. Yet everywhere he turned, another threat emerged. Overseers appeared from hidden corners, rifles discharged with lethal precision, and the once coordinated groups of rebels became scattered, forced into small pockets of defense and flight. The betrayal's impact was immediately apparent. Thomas had not merely warned the overseers of their plan, he had subtly misdirected them, ensuring that key positions were left vulnerable while others were reinforced. The symmetry of preparation so long nurtured was undone. In one of the quarters, a fire ignited unexpectedly. Perhaps a torch had fallen. Perhaps an enraged overseer had thrown a spark into the dry wooden structures. Flames climbed quickly, devouring the cabin with a hungry crackle, turning shadows into monsters and the night into a flickering inferno. The rebels nearby shouted warnings, but the fire spread faster than words could travel. Families who had been huddled in terror attempted to flee, but the heat, smoke, and chaos trapped many. The flames illuminated faces twisted with fear and courage, the lines between victim and fighter blurring in the harsh light. The revolt, already teetering on the edge of disaster, now carried a new uncontrollable force. Elijah found himself drawn to the fire, his instincts compelling him to rescue those trapped within the burning quarters. He tore through the smoke, dragging women and children out into the open, their skin streaked with soot, their eyes wide with panic. Around him, the sounds of death and struggle were relentless. Rifles cracking, clubs striking, cries echoing through the fields. The night was no longer a backdrop, but an active participant in the unfolding tragedy. Flames illuminating every movement, casting long, flickering shadows over faces young and old. The air was thick with smoke and fear, each breath a struggle, each step a gamble with survival. Amidst the chaos, some of the rebels attempted to regroup, forming small pockets of resistance in the fields beyond the immediate line of fire. These groups moved with urgency, but the cohesion that had defined their preparation was gone. The betrayal had fractured their trust, and every glance over the shoulder was tainted with suspicion. Friends once certain became potential liabilities, and the night became a maze of fear and violence. The sound of dogs barking and chains clanging cut through the air like knives, each alert a reminder that the plantation and its masters were still very much in control, despite the courage displayed by the rebels. The overseers, emboldened by foreknowledge and guided by Thomas's information, began rounding up the captured rebels with brutal efficiency. Men and women who had fought for freedom with all the force they could muster were subdued, bound, and driven toward the center of the plantation. The flames consumed more quarters, and the heat and smoke forced more people into dangerous exposure, creating a cycle of panic and capture. The revolt, which had begun with such promise, was rapidly deteriorating into slaughter, the courage of the enslaved pitted against betrayal and superior force. In the midst of this, Elijah became aware of Thomas moving separately from the main group, a signal of his prior betrayal. Rage and despair collided within him, yet there was no time for confrontation. The revolt demanded focus, every second a fight for survival. Elijah rallied what remained of the fighters, directing them toward a narrow path leading to the woods, hoping to salvage some chance of escape. Yet every step was fraught. Overseers blocked the main routes, dogs followed scents, and gunfire erupted intermittently, forcing the rebels into hasty decisions with no room for error. The night's carefully orchestrated strategy had dissolved into desperate improvisation, survival dependent on speed, luck, and courage alone. Amid the chaos, a particularly tragic moment unfolded. A family hiding in one of the barns was caught as the fire consumed the structure. The mother screamed for her children, attempting to shield them from the flames, but the heat and smoke were overwhelming. Elijah, torn between the immediate demands of the revolt and the impulse to save them, could do little beyond shouting warnings and attempting to redirect others toward escape. The fire spread too quickly and the barn collapsed in a fiery roar, claiming lives in an instant. The smoke rose in a dark column above the plantation, visible for miles, a grim testament to the cost of rebellion and the peril of betrayal. By the time the first gray light of dawn approached, the Smith Plantation had been irrevocably altered. Fires burned in multiple locations, smoke clung to the lowlands, and the survivors of the revolt, few in number and scattered, had either fled into the woods or been captured. The betrayal had ensured that the revolt's strategic advantage was nullified. The fire, though symbolically potent, became a destructive force that claimed innocent lives alongside the guilty. Elijah, moving through the misty aftermath, counted the losses silently. Faces once filled with hope now stared blankly, eyes wide in horror, bodies torn and exhausted. The rebellion, so meticulously prepared, had ended in devastation, its dream of liberation eclipsed by treachery and the raw force of the plantation's defenses. Even as the sun rose over the ruined fields, the memory of that night lingered like smoke, permeating every corner of the quarters, the woods, and the hearts of those who survived. Thomas's betrayal had ensured that the revolt's narrative would be one of tragedy, not triumph, yet it could not erase the courage displayed in the darkness. Each survivor carried with them the knowledge that resistance had been possible, however brief, and that even in the face of overwhelming force the human spirit had reached beyond its chains. The story of that night would travel quietly, whispered in the cabins of neighboring plantations, shared in clandestine moments, a cautionary tale of courage, betrayal, and fire. In the pale light of dawn, the Smith Plantation appeared transformed, unrecognizable from the orderly fields and rigid rows of cotton that had defined it only hours before. Smoke still curled lazily into the sky from the burned-out cabins and barns, their charred timbers marking the landscape with the indelible signs of revolt and punishment. The fields themselves bore the marks of chaos, overturned tools, trampled cotton, and footprints crisscrossing in every direction, some belonging to fleeing rebels, others to the overseers and patrols that now swept through the property with a brutal sense of purpose. The survivors of the uprising had either vanished into the woods or been captured in the confusion, leaving behind only the scorched evidence of their desperate struggle for freedom. The morning air carried a metallic tang, a mixture of blood, soot, and ash, embedding itself into the senses of anyone who walked the land, for the enslaved who had managed to survive. The dawn was not a reprieve, but the beginning of a new and agonizing ordeal. Elijah emerged from the woods near the eastern edge of the plantation, his body bruised and bloodied from clashes the night before. He moved cautiously, every sense alert to danger. The betrayal of Thomas weighed heavily on him, an invisible weight pressing against his chest with every step. He had thought, in his calculations, of nearly every variable: the routes through the swamp, the timing of patrols, the positions of dogs and overseers, the hidden messages in songs. Yet human treachery, subtle and quiet, had not been accounted for in the same way, and the consequences had been devastating. The young man pressed on, determined to locate those who had fled with him, to understand who had survived, and to find a safe place to regroup. Every movement through the dew-soaked undergrowth was deliberate. The sound of snapping twigs beneath his feet could mean death if discovered. The first survivors Elijah encountered were 2 women and a child, crouched near a grove of cypress trees, their faces streaked with soot and tears. They had been separated from the main group during the chaos, running blindly through the night to escape the overseers. Their relief upon seeing Elijah was tempered by exhaustion and the lingering fear that the hunters would find them even here. Together, they moved cautiously, weaving through the swampy terrain toward a distant hope of sanctuary. The journey was slow and perilous. The ground was uneven. Hidden pools of water threatened to pull them down, and every shadow of movement could signal an approaching patrol. The swamp, once thought a refuge, became a labyrinth of hidden dangers, each step a test of endurance, trust, and determination. Back at the plantation, the Smith family surveyed the aftermath with cold calculation. Though visibly shaken by the scale of destruction, their concern was framed in terms of property, reputation, and authority. The overseers had returned with reports of scattered bodies, burned cabins, and missing laborers, and the Smiths listened with detached intensity, their minds already planning the punishment that would follow. Guns were checked, dogs fed and readied, and men were dispatched to scour the surrounding woods, rivers, and swamps for any who had escaped. The plantation, which had always been a microcosm of control and domination, now teetered on the edge of chaos, and the Smiths were determined to reassert their authority through force, terror, and retribution. As the hunt for survivors intensified, Elijah and the small group moved silently through the swamp and forest, guided by knowledge passed down from those who had fled before them. Every rustle, every bird call, every broken branch was read as a potential threat. They knew that the Smiths would not stop until every participant had been punished, and that even those who had not actively participated could be swept up in the violence. The psychological toll was immense. Fear and grief intertwined with the adrenaline of survival, leaving little space for reflection or respite. Yet amidst this, the group relied on each other for support, sharing food, water, and encouragement, building fragile structures of trust in a world that had betrayed them at every turn. The scope of the disaster became clearer as the day wore on. Several captured rebels had been displayed publicly in the fields, bound to posts and subjected to punishment, intended as both retribution and deterrence. The bodies of those who had fallen in the fire or the struggle were left where they lay, a grim tableau meant to serve as a lesson. Survivors who remained hidden in the forest could hear the shouts, the commands, and the occasional crack of gunfire as the Smiths' men carried out their hunt. Each sound reinforced the horror of the night before, reminding Elijah and his companions of the high cost of their defiance and the thin line between courage and annihilation. Among those hunted were not only men but women and children, the youngest witnesses to the violence and the terror of rebellion. Their cries and panicked whispers carried through the woods as they were driven to hiding, learning early the cruel arithmetic of life under bondage. Elijah sought to protect them, guiding them through narrow channels of swamp and forest, urging silence and patience, teaching them to read the natural world as both ally and shield. The lessons were harsh but necessary, a survival education written in the language of fear, endurance, and instinct. The children, though terrified, absorbed every warning, their eyes wide and alert, understanding in small, urgent fragments the perilous reality that surrounded them. Despite the brutality of the pursuit, there were small acts of humanity that persisted, glimmers of solidarity that refused to be extinguished. Sympathetic neighbors, themselves enslaved or free people of color, offered discreet guidance, small quantities of food, or shelter in hidden cabins and hollowed-out areas along the riverbanks. These acts were dangerous for both giver and receiver, yet they created a network of tenuous support, threads of hope woven through the perilous landscape. Elijah and the survivors moved carefully, aware that every interaction could mean either sustenance or discovery, and yet they risked these encounters because survival required connection, and the human spirit demanded it. Thomas, the betrayer, had retreated into a cautious, self-preserving position, avoiding direct confrontation yet remaining within earshot of the overseer's command. The tension his presence created among the survivors was palpable. Trust, already fragile, now hung by a thread, as Elijah and others questioned who could be relied upon and who might harbor ulterior motives. Yet the need for unity was inescapable. Isolated, they would fall one by one to the relentless pursuit. And so, with careful guidance, Elijah continued to lead, balancing suspicion with necessity, anger with prudence, and the desire for vengeance with the practicalities of survival. The surrounding community, though largely fearful, began to stir with news of the revolt. Even distant plantations and settlements received fragments of the story. Cabins burned, men and women fled into the forest, overseers humiliated, and fires illuminating the night sky for miles. Each retelling, however fragmented and often distorted, spread both fear and hope. Fear among the masters, hope among the enslaved. The story became symbolic, a cautionary tale of both courage and the consequences of betrayal, reaching beyond the immediate geography of the Smith Plantation to resonate in whispered conversations and hidden songs across the region. Over the following days, the search intensified, and the landscape itself seemed to close in on the survivors. Every creek, every ridge, every hollow offered both shelter and danger. Elijah moved methodically, avoiding roads and patrols, using every lesson learned from elders in previous generations. Food was scarce, water sometimes stagnant, and exposure to the elements relentless, yet their determination never wavered. Each moment of hardship reinforced the stakes, reminding them that freedom, when pursued under the threat of annihilation, demanded endurance beyond ordinary human measure. In the aftermath, Elijah reflected on the fragility of plans forged in secrecy and hope. The revolt had been meticulously prepared, yet human weakness, fear, and treachery had transformed their dream into catastrophe. And yet he recognized that their courage had not been entirely in vain. The uprising had disrupted the plantation's operations, exposed the vulnerability of its overseers, and ignited a story of defiance that would travel through generations. Even in tragedy there existed the seed of possibility, a proof that the desire for liberty could not be wholly extinguished, even when betrayed, burned, or hunted. The days following the failed revolt on the Smith Plantation were marked by relentless pursuit and an atmosphere of terror that extended far beyond the fields themselves. The Smiths, incensed by the destruction of property and the audacity of the rebellion, mobilized every resource at their disposal. Patrols scoured the surrounding forests and swamps, tracking footprints and listening for the faintest noises of life in hiding. Dogs, trained to detect and pursue, were released in coordinated searches, their sharp noses and relentless instincts making the woods an arena of peril for anyone fleeing. Survivors, already exhausted from the night of revolt, were forced to navigate the dense landscape with limited knowledge of where safety might lie. Every step was a gamble between life and death. Every movement carried the potential for discovery. Elijah led the small band of survivors with a mix of urgency and careful calculation, understanding that the plantation's men and dogs were methodically reducing the safe spaces available. They moved at night, hiding during the day, relying on the swamp and thick undergrowth for cover. Hunger gnawed at them and thirst threatened to weaken their resolve, yet they persisted. Every lesson Elijah had learned in the months of planning, the reading of the land, the signals of nature, the awareness of patrol patterns, was now tested to its limits. The betrayal of Thomas remained an ever-present shadow, a reminder that human treachery could be as deadly as the overseer's rifles. Even as they pressed forward, he lingered somewhere unknown, a potential catalyst for further misfortune. The surrounding community, particularly enslaved and free people living in the peripheries of plantations, was both a threat and a lifeline. Some offered clandestine support, a hidden path through a neighbor's field, a small ration of food left beneath a log, a whispered warning about the movements of patrols. These acts of courage, though small, became crucial in sustaining the fugitives. They were not mere gestures of kindness, but calculated risks that could mean life or death for both giver and receiver. Elijah understood that the web of support had to be navigated carefully. Exposure could result in capture for everyone involved. The human network of assistance, fragile and ephemeral, became the lifeline on which their survival depended. As the pursuit continued, the psychological toll on the survivors intensified. Sleep was a luxury they could not afford, and when it came, it was shallow, fragmented, punctuated by nightmares of fire, violence, and betrayal. The memory of the revolt, the crackling flames, the shouts of dying friends, the chaos of sudden gunfire, haunted every step. For the children who had survived, the trauma was immediate and raw. They clung to adults with a mix of fear and dependence, learning to navigate the perilous landscape through observation and instinct. The emotional weight of responsibility fell heavily on Elijah, who now not only guided them physically through the wilderness but carried the burden of their survival and morale. Thomas, the young man whose betrayal had precipitated much of the disaster, moved cautiously through the shadows of the pursuit, maintaining a distance that allowed him to observe without being directly implicated. His presence cast a shadow over the survivors' efforts, sowing seeds of doubt and tension. Some suspected him, though the exact nature of his betrayal was not yet fully understood. The tension among the remaining rebels required careful management. Elijah worked tirelessly to maintain cohesion, reminding them that unity, however fragile, was essential to survival. Distrust, while understandable, could be fatal if it undermined collective action in a landscape where every moment demanded vigilance. The Smiths, meanwhile, were determined to reclaim not only property but authority, driven by the conviction that rebellion must be met with exemplary punishment. Overseers and hired hunters pursued survivors with escalating brutality. Captured rebels were bound and returned to the plantation to be publicly punished, often subjected to whipping or worse in view of others, reinforcing the lesson that defiance carried lethal consequences. These displays, intended to quell further insurrection, instead left an indelible mark on the region, a mixture of fear, grief, and simmering outrage that would linger long after the fires had burned out. Families were torn apart, friendships tested, and communities left to reckon with the cost of courage and the price of human resilience under oppression. Amidst the chaos, some of the fleeing survivors managed to find temporary sanctuary in the woods along the Mississippi River. Here, they encountered other fugitives, some from neighboring plantations, others who had fled from previous crackdowns, forming small clusters of resistance and mutual aid. They shared knowledge of patrol schedules, secret hiding places, and food sources, creating an informal network of survival that allowed them to regroup. This emergent community, though still vulnerable, represented a living testament to human resilience and the indomitable desire for freedom. Shared stories of the revolt, even in fragments, became a form of morale and a reminder that the spirit of defiance could not be entirely extinguished. Yet the dangers remained omnipresent. The Smiths' hired hunters were ruthless, employing tracking skills honed over years of hunting humans and animals alike. The dense forest and swamp, though providing concealment, also constrained movement and imposed physical strain. Dehydration, exhaustion, and injury threatened the group at every turn. Each night of movement was a negotiation with the land itself. River currents, treacherous marshes, and dense undergrowth demanded constant attention and ingenuity. Survival was not merely a matter of courage, but a calculated dance with a hostile environment. The human and natural worlds intertwined in a struggle that left no room for error. The psychological weight of betrayal, loss, and constant fear created internal conflicts among the survivors. Arguments arose over the direction of movement, the allocation of limited resources, and the prioritization of safety versus urgency. Decisions carried moral weight as well as practical implications. Should they leave behind the weak or injured to ensure the survival of the group? Could they trust the new members encountered along the way? Every choice was a balance of ethics, strategy, and human instinct, a test of leadership under extreme duress. Elijah's role became increasingly demanding, as he mediated disputes, motivated the group, and kept attention focused on the practicalities of survival in the face of overwhelming odds. Despite the overwhelming hardships, small victories persisted. Several survivors managed to elude patrols by concealing themselves in natural formations, under logs, inside hollow trees, or beneath dense foliage. Food was procured from the forest, fish caught in the river, edible plants, and small animals trapped or snared. These successes, though minor in scale, were psychologically significant, providing proof that the group's resilience could counter the relentless pursuit. Every moment of sustenance, every narrowly avoided capture, reinforced the fragile thread connecting survival, hope, and eventual liberation. As the days passed, the consequences of the revolt rippled through the broader community. News of the uprising, and the subsequent punishment of captured rebels, traveled quietly yet persistently through neighboring plantations and settlements. Families whispered the story in hushed tones. Songs incorporated veiled references to courage and loss. Children learned through indirect tales that the fight for freedom came at a tremendous cost. The revolt became both a warning and an inspiration, a cautionary tale of what betrayal and overwhelming force could inflict, and a reminder that the desire for liberty could ignite even under the most oppressive conditions. Elijah and the remaining survivors eventually reached a more remote stretch of the river, where natural features offered a semblance of security. Here they paused to tend to wounds, gather provisions, and plan the next stage of their movement. Though exhausted both physically and emotionally, they began to share memories of the revolt, recounting moments of courage, ingenuity, and solidarity. These recollections served multiple purposes. They reinforced cohesion, allowed for the processing of grief, and preserved the narrative of resistance for the future. Each story was a testament to human endurance, a reminder that even in tragedy, the spark of defiance could survive. Even as they pressed forward, the shadow of Thomas's betrayal continued to loom. The young man's choices had altered the course of the revolt, creating vulnerabilities that the survivors had narrowly escaped. His presence was a reminder of the complexity of human behavior under pressure, the collision of fear, self-interest, and moral compromise. Elijah, while wary, sought to focus the group on the immediate threats, knowing that dwelling too long on betrayal could fracture morale and weaken the resolve necessary to survive in a hostile environment. The long-term consequences of the failed revolt began to crystallize. The Smith Plantation would rebuild, its authority temporarily restored, yet the memory of that night lingered. Among the enslaved, whispered accounts of the courage displayed, the fire that burned, and the treachery that had thwarted freedom circulated like a shadow across the land. For those who had fled, the memory of the revolt became a guide, a template for resilience, and a painful but instructive example of both the potential and the peril inherent in resistance. The events of those nights left a scar not just on the land, but on the psyche of an entire community, a reminder that the struggle for freedom was inseparable from suffering, vigilance, and the human capacity for both loyalty and betrayal. Weeks had passed since the fires consumed the Smith Plantation, yet the reverberations of that night continued to ripple outward, reaching far beyond the burned-out quarters and trampled fields. The surviving rebels remained scattered, their numbers diminished by capture, death, and exhaustion, yet they pressed forward, driven by a fragile hope that liberty might still be attainable in the shadows of the oppressive landscape. Elijah's group, now smaller and more cautious, moved deeper into the swamps and forests bordering the plantation, learning to read every detail of the land with acute awareness. The rustle of reeds, the calls of distant birds, even the subtle differences in soil texture became tools of survival, helping them avoid patrols and identify potential hiding places. The swamp, once a symbol of confinement and isolation, had transformed into a sanctuary, treacherous and unforgiving, yet offering protection from those who sought to reclaim them. Each day brought new tests of endurance. Hunger gnawed relentlessly at their bodies, and the risk of disease in the marshes was ever present. Wounds from the revolt, both physical and emotional, demanded attention, yet medicine and supplies were scarce. The group learned to improvise, using herbs and natural remedies when available, drawing on the knowledge of elders who had survived prior hardships. Water was carefully rationed, food scavenged or trapped, and shelter constructed from reeds and fallen branches. Every night of rest was tentative, every day of movement fraught with danger, yet the human drive for survival remained unbroken. The shared experience of flight, fear, and endurance forged bonds between them stronger than any that had existed before the revolt. A quiet solidarity born in extremity. The pursuit by the Smith's men continued with relentless intensity. Word of the revolt had spread quickly among neighboring plantations, and hired hunters supplemented the overseers, increasing the frequency and reach of patrols. Dogs tracked scents through mud and underbrush, their keen noses relentless in following trails that the rebels attempted to mask. Even small mistakes, a misstep, a snapped twig, the rustle of clothing in the wind could reveal their presence and bring sudden death. Survival depended not just on courage but on constant vigilance, the ability to anticipate and outmaneuver an enemy whose familiarity with the terrain rivaled that of the fugitives. Elijah's role as leader became more complex, balancing the need for speed with the necessity of caution, ensuring that both the young and the injured were not left behind in the relentless flight. Despite the dangers, the rebels occasionally encountered small acts of solidarity and compassion that sustained their resolve. Families in remote homesteads, sympathetic free people of color, and other fugitives offered discreet assistance, hidden supplies, knowledge of safe paths, or temporary shelter. These gestures, though risky, provided tangible proof that networks of resistance could exist even under oppressive circumstances. Every encounter was fraught with tension. Discovery could lead to immediate execution or brutal punishment, yet the shared risk created bonds of trust and mutual dependence that became vital to survival. In the quiet of these moments, Elijah reminded the group that even fleeting kindness could serve as a lifeline, a reminder of the humanity that persisted despite the brutality surrounding them. As the survivors moved through the landscape, the emotional toll of the revolt became increasingly apparent. Memories of the fire, the screams, and the death haunted every step. Young children clung to adults with trembling hands, their eyes wide and uncomprehending, forced to process horrors far beyond their years. The adults themselves carried both grief and guilt, the agony of those lost in the flames, the suffering inflicted upon captured comrades, and the lingering sense of betrayal from Thomas's actions. The psychological burden was as formidable as any physical obstacle, shaping every decision, every pause, every choice to move forward. In these moments, the moral weight of leadership became clear. Survival demanded more than physical skill. It required emotional resilience, empathy, and the ability to maintain hope in the face of despair. Thomas, though still in proximity, moved with caution, observing the rebels' movements without direct engagement. His continued presence was a reminder of human complexity, the intertwining of fear, self-interest, and betrayal in moments of crisis. The knowledge that one's trust could be exploited made every interaction a potential threat. Elijah, while aware of Thomas's duplicity, focused on immediate survival, understanding that dwelling on treachery could weaken the group's cohesion and distract from the more immediate dangers of pursuit. The ever-present tension between suspicion and necessity shaped every decision, highlighting the precarious balance between vigilance and trust in extreme circumstances. The environment itself became an ally and a challenge. The swamp and forest provided cover but also imposed severe limitations. Thickets and marshes slowed movement, increasing fatigue. Rivers and creeks offered both water and obstacle. The dense canopy concealed sightlines, making navigation difficult. Yet these same features allowed the rebels to evade patrols, using natural barriers and concealed pathways to their advantage. Elijah taught the group to read subtle signs, broken reeds indicating a recent passage, disturbed mud revealing the direction of a patrol, the call of a bird signaling human presence. Every moment demanded acute attention, every movement a negotiation with both the natural world and the human threat pursuing them. The group also became adept at improvisation under extreme pressure. They constructed makeshift rafts to cross narrow rivers, fashioned temporary shelters from brush, and devised strategies to mislead hunters and dogs alike. Their knowledge of the terrain, combined with the lessons learned from previous generations and their own experiences during the revolt, allowed them to survive in conditions that would have been fatal for the unprepared. These strategies, born of necessity, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both the environment and human behavior, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of those who had risked everything for freedom. As they moved, stories of the revolt and its aftermath spread quietly among other enslaved people and sympathetic neighbors. The narrative became both cautionary and inspirational, a tale of courage and defiance tempered by betrayal and loss. Songs, work chants, and whispered conversations carried the memory of the night, encoding lessons of vigilance, solidarity, and the risks inherent in rebellion. Even in defeat, the revolt became a living story, passed along through generations, preserving the names and deeds of those who had dared to challenge the brutal order of the plantation system. The memory of fire and blood became inseparable from the memory of courage and hope, a paradox that defined the legacy of the Smith Plantation uprising. Despite the small victories of evasion and survival, the physical toll on the rebels was severe. Hunger, exhaustion, and untreated injuries weighed heavily, and the lack of consistent shelter exposed them to harsh weather, further weakening their bodies. Every day of movement demanded difficult decisions, whether to slow pace to aid the weak, whether to risk foraging in visible areas, whether to confront hunters or avoid them entirely. The choices were fraught, and each one carried moral as well as practical consequences. Elijah, as leader, bore the responsibility for every outcome, every life lost or preserved, and the mental strain was almost unbearable. Yet he persisted, driven by a belief that the pursuit of freedom justified every risk and every moment of suffering endured in the struggle to survive. Over time, the scattered survivors began to coalesce into small temporary networks of mutual support. They shared knowledge of patrol schedules, hidden food caches, and safe paths through the marshes and forests. These emergent communities, though precarious, created spaces of relative security and allowed for limited recuperation. Conversations, when possible, revolved around survival, strategy, and the memory of those who had been lost. Stories were exchanged, teaching lessons learned through experience and preserving the narrative of courage amidst disaster. The revolt, though crushed in immediate terms, had planted seeds of resilience and resistance that could not be entirely extinguished. The psychological landscape of survival also highlighted the complexities of human behavior under extreme conditions. Fear, grief, and trauma coexisted with courage, ingenuity, and solidarity. Thomas's betrayal served as a continual reminder that human choices could amplify danger as much as courage could create opportunity. The survivors were forced to navigate not only the natural and human threats, but also the emotional and ethical dimensions of their flight. Who to trust, how to share resources, when to act, and how to sustain hope in a world that had shown them little mercy. Every decision carried consequences, shaping not only their immediate survival but the moral and emotional fabric of the small communities they formed. Months had passed since the flames consumed the cabins of the Smith Plantation, yet the echoes of that night persisted in every shadow of the Mississippi lowlands. The revolt, though crushed in immediate terms, had left a scar that extended far beyond the charred remains of timber and cotton. Survivors, scattered and hunted, continued to navigate a landscape transformed by violence, fear, and memory. The relentless pursuit by the Smiths' men and their hired trackers persisted well into the months, creating a constant tension that made even the quietest moments fraught with peril. For those who remained free, life had become a continuous negotiation between hope and survival, each day an exercise in vigilance, cunning, and endurance. Elijah's group, reduced to a handful of the original conspirators, had learned to move almost invisibly through the dense forests and swampy terrain. They had mastered the art of concealment, using natural features to obscure their movements, and employing the knowledge gained from months of preparation during the initial revolt. Every creek, ridge, and thicket became both obstacle and refuge, a terrain of life and death that demanded acute observation and quick adaptation. Despite their skill, the psychological weight of the prior massacre loomed large. The memory of fire, the screams of friends and families, and the betrayal that had set them on this perilous path never fully left them. Yet in these shared memories they found a fragile form of cohesion, a collective will that drove them forward even as exhaustion and grief threatened to consume them. The ongoing threat of capture meant that survivors rarely stayed in one location for long. Temporary encampments were established in hidden groves, beneath overhanging riverbanks, and in dense thickets, each designed for concealment rather than comfort. Food was scavenged, trapped, or discreetly provided by sympathetic neighbors, and every resource had to be carefully rationed. Injuries and illnesses went untreated, yet the human body proved remarkably resilient in these conditions, adapting to scarcity, exposure, and constant movement. The survivors' days were marked by a relentless cycle of vigilance, foraging, and rest, each element essential for the maintenance of life. Sleep, though brief and uneasy, became a precious commodity, a fragile reprieve from the omnipresent threat of detection. The shadow of betrayal continued to shape the survivors' experiences. Thomas had not disappeared completely, and rumors of his presence, real or imagined, hung over them like a specter. Distrust was a constant undercurrent, influencing decisions and shaping interactions within the group. Elijah, ever conscious of the necessity of cohesion, worked to mediate tensions, emphasizing the shared stakes and the necessity of collective survival. The delicate balance between suspicion and trust became a defining feature of their existence, each decision imbued with moral and practical consequences. The lesson was clear. Human frailty could be as dangerous as the rifles, dogs, and merciless overseers pursuing them. Meanwhile, the Smiths consolidated control over their plantation, repairing structures, reinforcing their authority, and intensifying surveillance across neighboring lands. Punishments of captured rebels were severe and public, intended to deter any thoughts of further defiance. Whippings, public humiliation, and forced labor were employed to reinforce the hierarchy and to communicate the cost of rebellion. Yet these measures, while temporarily effective, also sowed seeds of enduring resistance. Stories of courage, of fleeting victories, and of the audacity of the revolt circulated quietly among the enslaved population, passed in hushed tones and through coded songs. Even in defeat, the uprising had inspired a recognition that resistance, though perilous, was possible, and that the desire for freedom could not be entirely extinguished. Beyond the immediate region, news of the revolt spread like a shadowed current, reaching neighboring plantations and communities. The narrative became layered with caution and inspiration. A tale of bravery met with devastating consequence, a stark reminder of both the risks and the possibilities inherent in defiance. Among enslaved populations, the story of Elijah and the others became a quiet rallying point, a testament to human courage in the face of overwhelming oppression. For free people of color, it underscored the precariousness of existence under a society structured to deny basic humanity, yet also revealed the enduring potential for solidarity and resistance. The revolt, though physically quelled, had left a social and psychological imprint that outlasted the immediate violence. Survivors eventually began to disperse into smaller, more clandestine networks, seeking refuge with sympathetic families, hidden cabins, and isolated settlements along the Mississippi River. These pockets of refuge allowed them to recuperate, share stories, and preserve the memory of the revolt. The transmission of knowledge about navigation, foraging, evasion, and survival became essential, ensuring that even the youngest members of the group could participate in their own protection and learn lessons that might one day aid others. Oral histories whispered at night and encoded in song or ritual preserved both the factual and symbolic elements of the uprising, creating a living archive that would survive long after the physical traces of the revolt had faded. In the more remote areas, some survivors began to integrate into larger communities of escaped enslaved people, forming tentative alliances and sharing resources. These emergent networks were fragile and always under threat, yet they demonstrated the human capacity for resilience and organization, even under extreme oppression. The knowledge and experience gained from the Smith Plantation Revolt became a resource for these communities, providing insight into both the vulnerabilities of plantation surveillance and the possibilities for coordinated action. Every movement, every shared lesson, and every act of mutual aid became a small act of defiance, sustaining hope even amidst continued danger. For Elijah, the months of survival reinforced profound truths about human endurance, courage, and the price of betrayal. The revolt had ended in tragedy, leaving scars both visible and invisible, yet the determination of those who had survived testified to an indomitable spirit. He reflected on the losses endured, the courage displayed, and the lessons learned. Each face remembered, each life spared, and each moment of ingenuity became part of a broader understanding of resistance. That freedom demanded not only courage, but foresight, resilience, and sometimes the ability to endure suffering in silence. The revolt had failed in its immediate objective, yet it succeeded in proving the capacity of the human spirit to challenge oppression, even at tremendous cost. By the close of the year, the Smith Plantation had returned to a semblance of order, yet the memory of the revolt lingered like smoke on the wind. The community of survivors, though dispersed, carried forward the legacy of courage and resistance, a living testimony to the night when rebellion had burned brightly, if briefly. Stories were shared, songs composed, and lessons preserved, ensuring that the revolt's meaning endured far beyond the immediate tragedy. Even in betrayal, loss, and relentless pursuit, the narrative of the Smith Plantation uprising became a symbol of defiance, illustrating both the horrors of slavery and the enduring capacity of people to resist and survive against impossible odds. In retrospect, the Smith Plantation Revolt was a crucible, exposing the profound moral and human complexities of rebellion under slavery. Courage and treachery, hope and despair, life and death were entwined in ways that defied simple understanding. The survivors' stories passed down through generations became more than historical events. They became a testament to human resilience and the enduring pursuit of freedom. The fires that had consumed the plantation, the betrayal that had altered the course of the revolt, and the relentless pursuit that followed were not simply episodes of violence. They were defining moments in the struggle for autonomy, memory, and dignity. The revolt, though physically defeated, had sown seeds of courage, solidarity, and historical consciousness that could never be entirely erased. And so, even in the shadow of tragedy, the memory of the Smith Plantation Revolt endured. It persisted, in the whispers of the woods, in the songs carried along riverbanks, and in the quiet resolve of those who refused to be broken by chains, fire, or betrayal. The story of courage and loss, of hope pursued against overwhelming odds, became a living part of history, a reminder that even in the darkest nights of oppression, human beings could envision and fight for freedom. In the legacy of Elijah and the survivors, the revolt found its ultimate significance, not in its immediate success but in its enduring testament to the resilience, courage, and unquenchable spirit of those who refused to be enslaved in.